In this video, we shall continue learning the story Be Wordsworth by V.S. Naipaul. In the previous videos, we find a beautiful friendship budding between B. Wordsworth and the narrator. And on seeing the incidents that happen, we come to know that B. Wordsworth has identity crisis and he tries to identify himself with the greatest poet B the greatest romantic poet William Wordsworth, and he calls himself as Black Wordsworth and White Wordsworth as his brother. And B. Wordsworth seems to be a colonized man, living in Alberta Street, Port of Spain, in colonized Trinidad. He was so colonized that he abandoned his native Trinidadian identity, so he spoke and acted English, so which alienated him from the rest of the people. So he is living in a single house, he is living in a hut, he is leading a different kind of life. Nobody has accepted him as a poet, but he considers himself as the greatest poet who is capable of writing great poems and all. And he teaches the narrator how to get the healing from nature, how to observe nature, how to enjoy nature. Once again, this is the idea of William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth calls nature as his guide, guardian, nurse, and all. So here, B. Wordsworth also gives the same idea to the narrator. So let's continue to learn. So here we find the narrator going to B. Wordsworth's home. After they get acquainted well one day, the narrator asks B. Wordsworth. One day I asked him, Mr. Wordsworth, why you does keep all this bush in your yard? Ain't it does make the place damp? He said, listen and I will tell you a story. Once upon a time, a boy and girl met each other and they fell in love. They loved each other so much that they got married. They were both poets. He loved words. She loved grass and flowers and trees. They lived happily in a single room, and then one day the girl poet said to the boy poet, we are going to have another poet in the family. But this poet was never born because the girl died and the young poet died with her inside her. And the girl's husband was very sad and he said he would never touch a thing in the girl's garden. And so the garden remained and grew high and wild. What is the question asked by the narrator? The narrator questions him why he is keeping all the bush in his yard. He doesn't have the habit of trimming all these things. Okay, for that, B. Wordsworth tells this story, but he doesn't say directly that he is the poet and he lost his wife and child and all. He doesn't say anything like that, but he simply says this story. I looked at B. Wordsworth, and as he told me this lovely story, he seemed to grow older. I understood his story. We went for long walks together. We went to the botanical gardens and the rock gardens. We climbed Chancellor Hill in the late afternoon and watched the darkness fall on Port of Spain and watched the lights go on in the city and on the ships in the harbor. He did everything as though he were doing it for the first time in his life. He did everything as though he were doing some church rite. So he did everything as though it was sacred. He would say to me, now, how about having some ice cream? And when I said yes, he would grow very serious and say, now, which cafe shall we patronize? as though it were a very important thing. So he'll seriously ask the narrator to which cafe they can go regularly. He would think for some time about it and finally say, I think I will go and negotiate the purchase with that shop. The world became a more exciting place for the narrator. One day, when I was in his yard, he said to me, I have a great secret which I am now going to tell you. I said, It really secret? I said, Is it really a secret? At the moment, yes. I looked at him and he looked at me. He said, This is just between you and me. Remember, I am writing a poem. So, what is the secret? See, the secret is that he is writing a poem. Oh, I was disappointed, he said, but this is a different sort of poem. This is the greatest poem in the world. So, when the narrator hears that B. Wordsworth is writing a poem and that is the secret, he becomes so disappointed. And for that, B. Wordsworth says that he is writing a different kind of poem, and it is the greatest poem in the world. I whistled. He said, I have been working on it for more than 5 years now. I will finish it in about 22 years from now. That is, if I keep on writing at the present rate. So, you can take it in two different ways. Here, B. Wordsworth wants to write the greatest poem, but he is incapable of doing that. Okay, so he is taking a lot of time to write, and he says that he will be finishing this poem in about 22 years. Okay, you does write a lot then. So if you want to have 22 more years to finish a poem, it means your poem must be very, very big, right? So do you write a lot then? He said, not anymore. I just write one line a month, but I make sure it is a good line. So see, B. Wordsworth says, see, I just write only one line a month, but I make sure that I'm writing a very good line. I asked, what was last month's good line then? So please tell me what was last month's good line. He looked up at the sky and said, The past is deep. So, this is the line for the last month. The past is deep. This doesn't seem to be a very wonderful line, isn't it? When you read this line separately, it doesn't seem to be a wonderful line. So, from this, we understand that B. Wordsworth is not a very great poet as he thinks him to be. Okay? I said, It is a beautiful line. B. Wordsworth said, I hope to distill the experiences of a whole month into that single line of poetry. So, in 22 years, I shall have written a poem that will sing to all humanity. So, this is his ambition. He has to write a poem that will appeal to the whole humanity, and he tries to distill the experiences of a whole month, which means he tries to extract the essence of a whole month and write it in a single line of poetry. I was filled with wonder. See the narrator, he is a very innocent fellow and he is filled with wonder. Our walks continued. We walked along the sea wall at Dockside one day, and I said, Mr. Wordsworth, if I drop this pin in the water, you think it will float? He said, This is a strange world. Drop your pin and let us see what will happen. The pin sank. I said, How is the poem this month? But he never told me any other line. He merely said, Oh, it comes, it comes. So we understand that B. Wordsworth hasn't written any lines after that. After the line, the past is deep, okay? Or we would sit on the sea wall and watch the liners come into the harbors, liners or the ships to transport people. So, from this, we understand that B. Wordsworth has the characteristics of the romantic poet. We cannot deny that. Okay, he even observes the path of a pin in water, and so he observes bees and all. He takes subjects from the common ordinary life and all. Okay, that we cannot deny it, but we can definitely say that he is not the greatest poet in this world, but he calls himself to be the greatest poet. Okay, but that is not the truth. Or we would occasionally they would sit on the sea wall and watch the liners come into the harbor. But of the greatest poem in the world, I heard no more. I felt he was growing older. How you does live, Mr. Wordsworth? I asked him one day. He said, you mean how I get money? So B. Wordsworth doesn't seem to be doing any work. He doesn't seem to be writing poems also. And we know that people do not buy his poems. So the narrator becomes curious and asks how he lives his life. When I nodded, he laughed in a crooked way. Crooked means not in an honest way. He said, I sing calypsos in the calypso season. So during the calypso season, I sing the calypsos. And that lasts you the rest of the year. Oh, you sing songs only during the calypso season? And oh, do the money you have, or can you manage to live with the money you get during the calypso season? It is enough, but you will be the richest man in the world when you write the greatest poem. So the narrator is asking whether he'll become the richest person in the world when he finishes his greatest poem. For that, B. Wordsworth doesn't reply. One day, when I went to see him in his little house, I found him lying on his little bed. So, here we understand that the narrator visits B. Wordsworth's house frequently, and one day, when he goes there, he sees him lying on his little bed. He looked so old and so weak that I found myself wanting to cry. He said, the poem is not going well, so he is not able to finish the greatest poem he wanted to write. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through the window at the coconut tree, and he was speaking as though I wasn't there. He said, when I was 20, I felt the power within myself. Then, almost in front of my eyes, I could see his face growing older and more tired. He said, but that was a long time ago. So he felt the power within himself when he was at 20s. What does it mean? He decided to become a poet when he was at 20. He felt the power within. But now he doesn't have the capacity to write poems anymore. And then I felt it so keenly, it was as though I had been slapped by my mother. I could see it clearly on his face. It was there for everyone to see. Death on the shrinking face. So, on seeing the face of B. Wordsworth, the narrator understood that he was nearing his death. He looked at me and saw my tears and sat up. He said, come. I went and sat on his knees. He looked into my eyes and he said, oh, you can see it too. I always knew you had the poet's eyes. So, why is the narrator crying? The narrator is crying because he knows that B. Wordsworth is going to die soon. Now, B. Wordsworth understands why the narrator is crying. So, he says, oh, you can see it too. And I always knew that you had the poet's eye. That's why you are able to see and understand things deeper. He didn't even look sad, and that made me burst out crying loudly. So, B. Wordsworth was not at all feeling sad, which made the narrator burst out loudly. He pulled me to his thin chest and said, Do you want me to tell you a funny story? And he smiled encouragingly at me. B. Wordsworth asked whether the narrator is willing to listen to a funny story. So when we saw the introduction, we learned that the story has dark humor in it, isn't it? So, what is dark humor? Humor which triggers sadness instead of laughter is called as dark humor, right? So, here B. Wordsworth proposes to tell a funny story to the narrator. Let's see what he tells. He said, "When I have finished the story, I want you to promise that you will go away and never come back to see me. Do you promise?" I nodded. He said, "Good. Well, listen. That story I told you about the boy poet and the girl poet, do you remember that? That wasn't true. It was something I just made up. All this talk about poetry and the greatest poem in the world, that wasn't true either. Is it that the funniest thing you have heard? Please mark this paragraph." So, this is a very sad thing. B. Wordsworth felt the power in his heart when he was 20. He started writing poetry when he was 20. He's been trying to prove himself as a poet for 40 years. Okay? When the policeman came and asked what these people were doing, he said that he was asking the same question to himself for 40 years. Right? So now, when he is at the verge of death, he tells the narrator that the talk about poetry, the greatest poem in the world, and calling himself as the greatest poet, everything is false, right? And he asks the narrator whether it is a funny story or not. But his voice broke, so he was filled with pain. Okay? So, from this, we understand that the story was true and he wanted to write a poem and he wanted to be the greatest poet in the world, but nothing came true. Okay, so now he doesn't want the narrator to follow his footsteps. That's why he's telling that he is a failure. In an indirect way, he tells that. I left the house and ran home crying like a poet for everything I saw. So the narrator goes home crying, and initially, B. Wordsworth told that a poet will see everything and cry, right? So here the narrator says that, like a poet, he goes home crying for everything he had seen. I walked along Alberta Street a year later, but I could find no sign of the poet's house. It hadn't vanished just like that. It had been pulled down, it was demolished, and the big two-storied building had taken its place. The mango tree and the plum tree and the coconut tree had all been cut down, and there was brick and concrete anywhere. It was just as though B. Wordsworth had never existed. So there was no trace of B. Wordsworth. So what do we come to know? On his deathbed, B. Wordsworth sets himself free from all illusions and dies. Okay, let me repeat it. It's very important. On the deathbed, B. Wordsworth sets himself free from all illusions and dies. See? He was living in an illusionary world, thinking that he was a great poet. He could write great poems and all. And he was identifying himself with White Wordsworth, W. Wordsworth. And he had the characteristics of the romantic poets. But on his deathbed, he sets himself free of all the illusions. He comes to reality. He realizes the fact that he is not a great poet. Okay? So that's how the story ends. We have several themes in this story. The first one is identity. See, we find an identity crisis in B. Wordsworth. B. Wordsworth seems to be a colonized person. He was so colonized that he abandoned his native Trinidadian identity. He was wearing a hat, a trouser, and all. Yes, you know all those things. So, he spoke and acted English, so he did not get the acceptance from his own people. So B. Wordsworth was having an identity crisis. Okay. Failure and disillusionment. So you know about it. B. Wordsworth was a failure. And we have the theme of about the love of nature. B. Wordsworth and the narrator have love for nature, and escapism is one of the most important themes present in this story. So what is escapism? Escapism is defined as a habitual diversion of the mind to purely imaginative activity or entertainment as an escape that allows people to forget about the real problems of life. Okay, you have to know this. What is escapism? Escapism is a habitual diversion of the mind to purely imaginative activity or entertainment as an escape that allows people to forget about the real problems of life. So, in this story, the reality did not please B. Wordsworth. What is the reality? The reality is that B. Wordsworth is not a great poet. He cannot write good poems, and people don't buy his poems. Yes? So that is the reality, and the reality did not please B. Wordsworth. So he escaped into an imaginary world, and in his imaginary world, he is a great poet. He has written the greatest poet, and he is trying to write the greatest poem. Do you understand, students? So, two worlds are described in this story: imaginary world and the real world. In the real world, B. Wordsworth is nothing. Okay, he is not a renowned personality, he is not a famous poet, but in his imaginary world, he is the greatest poet in the world. Do you understand? So, please go through the story again. If you read the story on the surface level, you may not be able to understand all these things, students. So I want you to go through this story again and again for your better understanding. That's all for today's class, students. Thank you.